Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from Europe, to be more precise from the NATO countries, and very interesting details are coming from Germany, from Berlin. First of all, we need to know that the European countries are getting ready to start war, real war and hostiles with Russian army. One would hope that these European leaders, politicians and military men that seem to be aching for war with Russia would at least get their narrative straight. For example, the German Bild claims Russia could attack Europe within a year, so this is opinion probably of German authorities, or at least used to be. The Polish leaders are saying that the European Union has 3 to 5 years to prepare for conflict with Russia. And later the Ministry of Defense, the lead of the German Ministry of Defense, again announced that threat of war with Russia, allocating 8 years for this. So what does it mean? That from one side you may say that 8 years, it's so far, it's not going to be very soon. Some sources are saying that the war with Russia in Europe will take place in 20 years or something like this. But now we will discuss the situation details, and you will understand that war between Europe and Russia, NATO and Russia, may start much earlier. First, we would like to point your attention to the Baltic states that took a decision to increase their defense belt with Russia and Belarus, and they're planning to create up to 600 strongholds, and they're planning to create few lines of defense. And because we understand, if the Russians are ever going to start any war with Europe, obviously the first target of Russian Federation is going to be the Baltic states. So it's the easiest way, and first of all, not just from the easiest perspective, the most important that Russia in this case will be able to establish, let's say, connection between Kaliningrad and, let's say, at least the Republic of Belarus, and to reduce any possibilities and risk of having some blockade of this part of Russia. Furthermore, we just discussed this previous update about the biggest military exercises in Europe for the previous tens of years, and according to them, the NATO countries are planning to collect 90,000 army somewhere on the eastern border of NATO, and there are going to be at least 20,000 soldiers from the United Kingdom, and so on. From one side, you might say that this is just a regular thing, the military exercises and so on, but you know that these military exercises remind me one thing. If you remember, during the 2014-2015, during the first war of Donbass, the Russians were having also some military exercises along the border with Ukraine. And while the Ukrainians were storming and doing these clashes, hostiles with Donbass people in Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Donetsk, the Russian army was concentrated along the border. And basically, because of those military exercises, the Russians, during that let's say first war, managed to concentrate significant number of forces along the border with Ukraine. And while the Ukrainians were trying to storm Donetsk, Lugansk, the Russians were sending reinforcements and help, like conscripts, like soldiers, like volunteers, like military support, tanks, armored vehicles. Everything was sent from that military trainings that took place, were held along the border with Ukraine. So basically, the situation with the Western countries with NATO trainings reminds me completely the same situation. The Western countries during the most difficult period of Ukrainian time will concentrate significant number on the western part of Ukraine just with one purpose, because they understand that if everything goes in Ukraine with a very best scenario for Ukrainians, like complete defeat from Russian army, the Western countries, NATO countries, won't have any other option, but they will launch not offensive, basically they will enter the western part of Ukraine. Furthermore, the most important, just pay attention that the military exercises of NATO countries are going to take place within the next few months until May, until the possible time, approximate time when the Russians, due to some circumstances, will finish their winter offensive, winter military campaign. And once again, if everything goes bad, the Western countries will enter the western part of Ukraine and will occupy this territory with one purpose: to slow down and to stop Russia. And now all these words of Western politicians about the possible war with Russia in 5, 7, 10, 20 years is just attempt to pay people's attention, to spread the talks among them. So first, you can't say that tomorrow Europeans, you need to be mobilized and to start war, some clashes somewhere in Donbass under Avdiivka. You can't tell people like this. First, you need to say that maybe in 5, 10 years there's going to be war with Russia. And people start talking about this, people start thinking about this, and people won't even see as they will appear somewhere in Avdiivka or somewhere in Odessa. So this is my opinion, but maybe I'm wrong. Furthermore, we got another update from Ukrainian authorities. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians have already started preparation before summer offensive operation. The Russians still haven't completed the winter military campaign, and according to the Ukrainians, they started the preparation for the summer offensive. And according to summer offensive, the Russians are planning to establish complete control over Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Furthermore, according to Ukrainians, the Russians during the summer military campaign are planning to capture Kyiv. And for these purposes, the Russians are planning to mobilize additional 400,000 people. So you might say that this is just speculation. It's just like attempts from the Western countries to slow down Russia. It's just attempt from the Russian side to scare Western countries in Ukraine. But let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the situation on the ground. And when talking about the situation on the ground, the worst updates ever are coming from Avdiivka direction. As you can see today, we have significant number of icons all over the entire Avdiivka, around Avdiivka. We start receiving them during this morning, and mainly when talking about Avdiivka during the previous 24 hours, we got just one geolocation, this one. On this video we can see how the Russians attacked the most eastern part fortification build of Ukrainians on the eastern part of Avdiivka, and because of that I have adjusted the map, because according to the most of the mappers, this territory is considered as the territory under Russian control, but now we have geolocation that it's not true. Now let's return back. So let's start from the beginning, because updates are very interesting and there are very many of them. According to Rybar, military Russian expert, the Russians managed somehow to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt, and as a result of very heavy clashes and hostiles to enter the eastern part of Avdiivka. To be more precise, the Russians established the intersections of the streets like Kirova and Livanevskого. So this is the area the Russian military expert was talking about. Of course, you might say how the Russians managed to bypass such a big territories and to enter this village that located so far from the Russian mainland. I would say that's very likely that this map is not like 100% correspond to reality. There might be some, let's say, changes. There might be some differences with the reality, obviously, because Rybar in the previous reports already told us that there was some progress of the Russians in this area. So I'm not saying anything, maybe Rybar is speculating, who knows, but according to him, the Russians entered this territory and now they're trying to dig in deeper on the eastern part of Avdiivka, and this is very important update. Later we got another update that the Russians, as a result of very heavy clashes, very heavy hostiles, managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt in the vicinity of industrial area and to capture another stronghold on the southeastern part of Avdiivka. And according to lots of more or less reliable sources, this territory is from now on under Russian control. So for now we are not going to update the map because of complete absence of geolocation, but at least when talking about the red color, but we will increase the gray zone in this territory. Furthermore, a lot of sources, including neutral, pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, reported about another wave of Russian attack from Vinogradniki in direction of residential area that located on the southern part of Avdiivka, including Tsarskaya Okhota fortification belt. And we have some maps. Some mappers have already updated their maps showing some certain Russian progress. So according to some more or less reliable resources, the Russians answered this part of Avdiivka and they continued developing their offensive operation. So as you can see, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, we got another update about the common situation in Avdiivka that we received from the Ukrainian sources. According to the armed forces of Ukraine on the situation in Avdiivka area, in one day the armed forces of Ukraine lost several positions in Kamenka area. They also had to give up fortifications in the Krasnogorovka area and 2 positions in the Oputny area. And near Pervomaiska, the Ukrainians lost 3 positions. From all these texts, we have already discussed most of those updates. The most important update from that report is that Ukrainians lost few positions in the vicinity of Oputne. And this is Oputne, and as I understand, as a result of Russian offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over this stronghold. So this is, as you can see, a very powerful fortification area. We can even probably see the trenches from the sky. Yes, we can see the trenches from the satellite picture. This is probably company stronghold, and the Russians captured this territory. And right before I start making this video, more or less Russian reliable resource reported that as a result of Russian offensive operation, to be more precise, as a result of RACO in force or RACO in combat, the edge Russian forces, scouts, managed to enter the chemical block, and to establish control over a few buildings between on the intersection of the 9th Quarter Streets and Kommunalny Street. If we go back to the map, if we zoom in, that Russian source was talking about these territories. So this is Kommunalny Street and this is 9th Quarter Street. So according to some more or less Russian reliable sources, as a result of offensive operation, the edge Russian positions, the edge Russian forces managed to bypass significant distance and to enter this territory. Also, this source added that the Russians managed to more or less to dig in deeper, but the question is whether these Russian forces are able to repel Ukrainian counterattacks during the upcoming night. So right now, on the 19th of January, the Russians entered the most powerful stronghold in Avdiivka, the 9th Quarter, and now the Russians are repelling the Ukrainian counterattacks. And if the Russians during upcoming night are able to repel every single Ukrainian attack, that there are going to be a lot of them, let's say from this direction, the Ukrainians will counterattack from the central part. So there are going to be a lot of counterattacks. And if the Russians are able to repel every single counterattack from the Ukrainian side, then during the night they will be able to bring more reinforcements to this area, and then this is going to be complete disaster for the Ukrainians. Furthermore, we have some report from the Ukrainian sources, more or less pro-Ukrainian sources that more or less, let's say, reliable from the Ukrainian side. And these sources reported, by the way, in front of your screen, you can see the picture from this 9th Quarter block, and this video photo was made from there. And the source reported that the Russians managed to enter Avdiivka and to capture some buildings. This source haven't provided us details about which block he was talking about, but according to photo, according to post on his channel, very likely he was talking about the same area. So as you can see, the Russians are attacking Avdiivka from 3 directions: from Krutaya Balka, Kamyanka in direction of Kirova and in direction of Kirova and Livanevskaya Street. The Russians are trying to develop their positions on the southern part, and the main purpose is to get as close as possible to Tsarskaya Okhota fortification and to this water pump station. And the Russians somehow managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt in the vicinity of Oputna and to enter the 9th Quarter. This is disaster for the Ukrainians, and according to these 3 directions, we understand that the Russian main goal is to collapse everything that located to the bottom from this red line. Furthermore, other Russian sources reported that the Russians managed to concentrate significant number of armored vehicles and tanks and to start offensive operation from Veselaya, Krasnogorovka on the eastern direction. So this is another another wave of attack. And now it's very difficult and complicated to say what the Ukrainians are planning to do with all these attacks. Do they have plan or not? And once again, why have I started with Avdiivka? Because because the NATO military exercises and the future of Ukraine completely depends on this situation. And right after Krynky, after Avdiivka, after all these battles, like Novomikhailivka as well, the snowball is going to become bigger and bigger, and there are more and more chances of very soon clashes even in the western part of Ukraine, and not just with the Ukrainians, if you know what I'm talking about. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation on the northern flank of Avdiivka. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions along the railways with tall flamethrower systems. As a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians had losses, and probably the Russians managed to improve their positions there as well. So that's it about Avdiivka. As we discussed in the previous video, there is some progress of the Russian forces in Pervomaiska. We will adjust the map due to the video we got today, some Russian progress in the village, and we will color this territory under Russian control. And the clashes continue moving further to the west in direction of the central part of, not even central, but eastern part of Pervomaiska, the big stronghold between Pervomaiska and Nevoyska itself. So the clashes in this area are going to be very hot during the next few days. We haven't received almost anything from Georgievka, just the Russian FPV drone strikes on the flanks of the village from the north and to the south. The Russians are mainly focused to clear the flanks and the sides of this defense belt, and after that they will be able to start the ground operation. But as I understand, the ground operation maybe have already started, so the situation is so critical. When talking about Novomikhailivka, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and the Russians are attacking this territory with broad front line. Their main purpose is to get with as many as possible forces the road TO524 and to collapse logistic between Ugledar, Vadian and Konstantinovka. The Russians reported that as a result of systematic fire, a concentration of manpower in the western part of Novomikhailivka was defeated. The Ukrainian lost the AGS crew and the let's say drones control central. In the vicinity of the settlement, up to 5 support forces of the Ukrainian armed forces were suppressed. Furthermore, the Russians managed to suppress and destroy a significant number of artillery systems between Yelizavetovka, Katerinovka and Vadiana in this area. Once again, we don't have any geolocated videos, we just have reports from the soldiers on the ground about the Russian progress. The only thing we have is Russian artillery and aviation bombings of Ukrainian true lines and positions to the north of Volodymyrovka and Mykolaiska, which we can say consider as the beginning of artillery preparation or aviation preparation before next Russian wave of attack on this line as well. So on the South Donetsk, the situation for the Ukrainians is also getting worse and worse. When talking about Zaporizhia area, we got also a lot of updates, and the most important is that the Russians for the first day in a row are bombing the Robotina with tall flamethrowers. We need to understand one thing about tall flamethrower system. The distance of missiles is too low, up to 6 kilometers. So you need to keep your artillery system, these multi-launch tall flamethrower systems, as close as possible, which means that the area around the tall flamethrower systems are more or less secured. If we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning, let's say even of this week, we see how many details, how many updates we received from this territory. We got FPV drone strikes on the south. We have FPV drone strikes from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians were attacking the Russians, trying to slow down and to defeat or to stop another Russian attack in direction of Robotina. We have the Russian flamethrower strikes and another cemetery of armored vehicles on the south of Robotina inside of the village. We have 2 tall flamethrower strikes in the same area during just the previous week. So while we are talking, people are discussing different things, the Russians launched another ground operation inside of Robotina. We haven't seen Russian soldiers on the ground inside of the village, but it doesn't mean that there are no Russians inside. There is a gap between geolocation, between video, any report, and the information we receive in Telegram or Twitter channels. Very likely that the Russians are already Robotyne, and they're storming the first streets and the first buildings on the south of direction. So the situation here develops for the Ukrainians also not so good. When talking about Krynky, we see that the intensifying of clashes, that the intensifying of actions has been reduced. No activity, almost nothing, just one geolocated video of Lancet strike and this strike probably took place maybe even a few days ago. So we see that complete, let's say, reduce of activity either from the Russian and from the Ukrainian side. We have a series of video from the river published by Sudoplatov. Significant number of armored vehicles, boats and so on were destroyed. They just cut all these videos all together and published, so the strikes that took place during the previous weeks. The only video we have and the only important update we have from the Ukrainian side. The Russian sources reported about the fact that they lost very experienced FPV drone operator Moisey. The Ukrainians managed to discover position of that FPV drone, and they managed to discover the base, and then they attacked the base probably with FPV or maybe with something else. And according to the Ukrainians and the Russian sources, this FPV drone operator Moisey was very experienced, and he has his own numbers of Ukrainian losses, and according to the sources we have, the Ukrainians lost more than 500 soldiers just as a result of work of this FPV drone operator. So this is a very heavy loss of Russian asset on this direction, military assets on this direction. Now we are moving back to Bogdanovka and Bogdanovka area, Artyomovsk, Bakhmut direction. We haven't received a lot of updates. The only thing that we have already discussed that the Russians, according to the lots of mappers, have already established control over this stronghold on the hill on the north of 215.7 position, and now the Russians are regrouping for further offensive operation in direction of Ivanovska. But when talking about this operation, we see that there are at least two strongholds right in front of the Russians and village itself. So this is not going to be like an easy trip. This is going to be a very heavy battle, clashes and hostiles, but anyway the Russians are moving further. No updates from Bogdanovka, just few geolocated videos from Orekhovo, Vasilievka and Grigorovka, how the Russians destroyed Ukrainian positions. We haven't received anything from Vesele. The Russians, after they managed to establish control over this village, are regrouping, trying to dig in deeper to prepare fortifications onto strongholds, maybe to prepare themselves before possible Ukrainian counterattacks. Obviously they need a day or two or even 3 or maybe even a week, and after that the Russians will renew their offensive operation, and as we discussed, the next target for the Russians is to attack Razdolovka. Now we are moving to Liman direction. We haven't received almost anything from this area, just few things, important things. And the first important thing is that the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on this direction, the Ukrainians lost 320 soldiers just during the previous week. So significant number of losses from the Ukrainian side just for one day, and this is the heaviest losses of the Ukrainians since the creation and since the establishing of this configuration of the front line. The losses even higher than the losses of Ukrainians on Donetsk direction. Very powerful clashes, very heavy hostiles in this area, and due to this geolocation now we have right to correct this map and to show this territory under Russian control, what we are going to do before the next video. Furthermore, the Russian published few more geolocations of FPV drones and artillery strikes against the Ukrainian positions. Once again, there are very heavy clashes right now. The Russians are pushing to Zhiribets, and the level of loss of the Ukrainians is the heaviest all over the entire combat line from Krynky to Kupiansk. Something very important is taking place right now here. When talking about Kupiansk direction, we don't have no updates, just some reports on the ground that the Russians launched a very big attack from Sinkovka to Kislovka, Kotlerovka, and even further in direction of Krakhmalna, Tabayevka. According to information we have, currently the Russians are trying to establish their positions along the road N26 and to establish control over and to, let's say, improve their positions and to, let's say, connect the footholds between Novoselievsk and, let's say, the southern part of Kislovka-Kotlerovka. So they need to create a foothold for further offensive operation in direction of Kruglyakivka and in direction of Sinkova. So this is the possible Russian direction. It's of course, very long attack, very unlikely the Russians are able to capture such a significant territories as a result of one attack, but it's just the global direction of possible Russian movements. So once again, the situation is getting worse and worse. Military exercises on the western part of Ukraine were as a plan B for Ukraine and Western countries if everything goes completely wrong for Ukraine. And according to my feeling, I think that everything will be developed in the worst way for Ukraine. And very likely we are going to see something from the western border of Ukraine. Something tells me that very bad things are going to happen within the next 2 or 3 months in the world and not just in Ukraine. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.